Welcome. Welcome everybody to today's afternoon webinar on the Faculty Amendment Rules 2022, which have been generally being called the Net Zero Carbon Rules, because the main driving force behind this revision of the faculty rules has been to support General Synod's call for all parts of the Church of England to work towards net zero carbon by 2030. You are all very welcome to today's webinar. I always begin my webinars with the preview of upcoming attractions. This is the last one before the summer break, and when we come back, there's one scheduled for the middle of September, which is on how central procurement can support parishes in the move towards net zero carbon. So you'll be hearing from Parish Buying and 2x2 about things like the energy audit programme, the green energy basket, solar panels and heating solutions that they can offer now through central procurement. And then we've just recently scheduled 2 sessions early in October on electric heating solutions. So that's going to cover the whole range of different electric solutions, direct electric solutions like pew heaters and panel heaters, chandeliers and cushion heaters. It's not covering heat pumps because that's a specialist subject that we have a separate webinar about. In terms of today's session, as usual, we will be using the Q&A for questions rather than the chat. So if you move your mouse about, find the Q&A, that's where to pop your questions. You can also see each other's questions and you can do thumbs up next to ones that you like, and those ones will rise to the top. And David and I will tackle them in that order when we get to the end of the slides. And after today's webinar, I will send everybody the slides and any links from the chat. And we are recording today's session and it will be made available through our website. That normally takes a couple of days, but if you check back to the website, you will see it there. Right, so your speakers today are my colleague David, who's the Senior Church Buildings Officer in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division, and myself, the Open and Sustainable Churches Officer. I'm part of the Environment Programme team based in the CCB. Right, I will stop sharing this set of slides and get up the main slides for the webinar. If you just give me a second to switch over. And then, David, you are leading us away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you to everybody for giving up your time today for this webinar and for all the things that you are doing either in your work or in your voluntary capacities to support churches, including on their move to net zero carbon, and doubtless with many other things as well. So thank you for your time today, and perhaps more importantly for all the time you put in day by day, week by week, and year by year. The next slide's got a reminder of the Synod motion we made in February 2020, before COVID and before quite a lot of other disruptions had happened to our lives and our economy, when the Synod put a really challenging target down for us to move to net zero carbon by 2030, 15 years ahead, I think, of what was in the motion that Synod was given. So a real strong challenge. Of course, with a strong challenge, a real benefit from that is acts as a tremendous call for action, which I suspect a call 15 years later would not have seen Catherine and I here quite so quickly talking about net zero carbon in the faculty rules if we had another 15 years to deal with it. So how did we get to where we are? Next slide shows the very start of this process, which came actually on the initiative of then new, now nearly new, Dean of Arches and Auditor, who is the most senior ecclesiastical judge, who in her day work is also an environmental lawyer who works on behalf of things for good environmental outcomes. And she was clear about her commitment to net zero carbon and wanted opportunities to see what she could do in her role as Dean and Auditor to help the Church rise to the commitment from the Synod to get to net zero carbon by 2030. She was also aware that her options are limited, partly because in most of church life the status quo is easier than change, and partly because quite a lot of her role is nothing to do with buildings or carbon, and where it is to do with buildings, it's responsive to what people come up with rather than going out there and suggesting what people might want to do. So what to do? She did 2 things. The next one is on the next slide. She had what she called a green working party. She got together a group of people who knew what they were talking about technically, who knew what they were talking about legally, and who understood what it was like to work in a diocese, to work in a DAC with parishes, to talk and come together to look at what would be desirable to have net zero rules, what would be good things to do, in both desirable because it would be a good thing to do, and actually desirable because it could be achieved through the rules. And as the group had its meetings, its conversations were interesting and they definitely developed. So at the start of it, there was quite a big range of ideas, quite some bold things that people wanted to do and some less bold ones. And as we looked at these options and thought about them, the working party was able to sort of think, well, actually, if we made this provision of the rules, what would be the outcome? And so we sort of weighed things, we discussed them, and came up with a set of provisions which are largely reflected in the amendment rules, which we think are a good balance between all the things you could do, all the things we're allowed to do because of the constraints faculty rules work under, and things where we need to be a little bit more cautious, because if you get good advice, you're going to get a better outcome than if you rush into it. And we think that the outcome of that working party was along those lines. And the next slide shows the intention of that, which again, I believe is reflected in the faculty rule amendments. So we want to make it easier to do what we would see as good practice with regards to carbon emissions, to reduce them. And although whatever you feel from the flavour of the rules, we do not ban works that would encourage or allow churches to make more carbon. We have made it, the church has to work harder to get its permissions for something that is going to increase carbon emissions than it does at the moment, or work harder for things that will commit it to making carbon after 2030. It can get permission, but it needs to just show that that is really the only reasonable way it could do something about it. And that is the intention of the rules, from a group of knowledgeable people who got together to think, what could we do through this particular tool? A little bit of context now, and hopefully some encouragement as well as some challenge. So this slide shows us where the church's carbon footprint came from in 2020. I suspect the proportions are fairly similar now, even if the numbers have shifted a tiny amount. So church schools are the biggest chunk of our carbon footprint, not surprising because they have a lot of people, a lot of activity, a lot of days of the year. And church buildings are the next biggest chunk of the Church of England's carbon footprint. Not surprisingly, because we have got a great deal of them, and even if they're not so busy, there are a lot of them. But if you look at that sector, which is at least red on my screen, cathedrals that make 2% of our carbon footprint, there are only 41 buildings. So there's not very many of them, but they're big and they're busy. And that is where our carbon footprint is coming from. As the next slide shows us, places which are big and places which are busy, on the whole, got a bigger amount of carbon coming out of them, and places which are small and places which are not busy. That actually shouldn't really be a surprise as soon as you think about it. And the data from our energy footprint tool suggests that 80% of our carbon emissions come from our 33% highest emitting churches. So you could almost call 80% most, comes from a third of our churches. And at the small end of the scale, 1% of our carbon comes from 25% lowest emitting churches. So quarter of the churches, the smallest carbon emitters, make up 1% of our total, yet it's quite a big number of churches. So there's going to be a chunk of churches where there's not a great deal of people, probably, and not that many things happening when the building is being heated particularly, which won't face that bigger a challenge. And there's a bigger and busier buildings where there are more people around, so probably more money and more people to engage with things, where there's going to be that bigger challenge. So the bigger challenge is likely to be falling where there are more people. It won't make it easy, but at least where the challenge is bigger, it's because it's busy, it's because there are more people around, because there is more happening, and possibly even more sources of income to fund things that may need to be done. Next slide shows the big challenge and will instantly help you to understand why the faculty rule changes look like they do. 84% of the church's carbon from the sample of churches we looked at, 84% of our carbon emission came from heating, and lighting was 6% on other 10%. So 84% from one type of activity. A big challenge, and the most complex bit of our energy used to decarbonize and do something about. This is why the net zero faculty rules, as we're calling them, They've given so much attention to heating and how churches are heated, and for heating systems that continue to produce carbon post 2030, put down the fresh requirements to demonstrate that that is what is needed and there isn't another way of doing it. So it's a big challenge, and the rules reflect that. They don't ban things, but they do make you have to really show that there really isn't another way. Let's encourage ourselves now with the next slide. This is a slide which shows recommendations from energy audits for 181 churches, and the blue lines heading off to the side of the screen show you actions that each of those churches could take to help reduce their carbon footprint. So out of that group of churches, a very high number of them could help their carbon footprint by switching to 100% renewable electricity. I think this graph was got up before the current turbulence in the energy market, so talking about switching tariffs and things now possibly is not the optimal time for doing it, but in due course the market will surely have to get clearer again, and there are a lot of churches who could switch to renewable source electricity to help their carbon footprint. There are other things in here which don't involve putting in a lot of new kit, but perhaps making changes to kit you've got, changes to the type of lamps you've got in your lamp fittings, or changes to the type of fittings you've got at the end of the wiring to get better energy performance by using LED lamps. And I was personally quite surprised how many churches have still got legacy non-LED lamps in use. There are also things you will have noticed on the lines of this graph that don't involve spending money, and that don't involve buying anything or doing anything new, but just using what you have got better. I realise this involves thought, it might involve taking advice about how to do it, but it's not aimed at spending money, but just things like using your heating controls that you already have, using them in a more optimal way, thinking about how your behaviours are and seeing if behavioural changes could help your church reduce its carbon footprint. And in fact, in this sample, 1/3 of them can help their carbon footprint by behavioural change, which is quite a thing, really. And then there's a quarter of them, I think, or a bit less than that, who could think about their background heating or the temperature of their heating as a way of reducing their carbon footprint. So just using what you have got in a smarter way and yet getting a carbon benefit, probably using less energy before you ever start needing to spend money on producing new things, putting in new kit, and so on.
So David has given you the context into which the work on the faculty rules took place. And I'm going to take you through the specific changes that have been made to the rules. So the changes that were voted through at February General Synod and will come into effect from July. Please do feel free to take notes, but at the end, I'll send everybody the slides, and I'll also send you a copy of the new faculty rules and a copy of List A and List B that's marked up to show what the changes are. So it's marked to show what's come out and what's been put in. The first significant change is an overall requirement to have due regard to net zero carbon guidance. So there's a new clause in the faculty rules which defines what net zero guidance is. And then there's a clause in section 3.3 that says, if the proposal involves a matter to which net zero carbon guidance applies, the proposal must include an explanation of how the applicants in formulating their proposal have had due regard to that guidance. So it's requiring people to have read the guidance and requiring them to say in their application whether what they're putting forward follows that guidance, or whether if you've moved away from it, why that's the case, because you've had due regard of that guidance. So if it's a List B matter, then the proposal sent to the Archdeacon must include that explanation of how the applicants in formulating the proposal have had due regard. If it's a full faculty application, the same. And then for those matters which go to the DAC, the notice of advice must then address whether the net zero carbon advice has been adequately addressed. That's therefore quite an overarching requirement across a lot of different kinds of faculty applications. To make it simpler for parishes to know what do we mean by net zero carbon guidance, we've created a new section on our website, and we have grouped in one place on our website all of those key pieces of guidance. So if I click on here, and look at David to give me a thumbs up if that has worked. Any joy, David? Very good.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this is now through to our website. There's a page underneath the Church Buildings Council, how we manage our buildings. And this page has always been there, and it's the main page that explains how the faculty system works and who does what in the faculty system. There's a new section now, the Faculty Amendment Rules 2022 Net Zero. And if you go to that section, you will find all in one place the key pieces of net zero guidance that it's required to have due regard to. So there's the practical path of net zero carbon, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. There are 3 of the sections of our heating guidance. So the whole of the heating guidance, I hope you'll find very helpful. These 3 sections are the ones which we think it's most important that a parish has had due regard to. So the principles, the checklist, and the options appraisal. There's then the EV car charging guidance, solar panel faculty guidance, biomass lighting, and flood lighting. In this same section, although not a document that's required by the rules, we've also popped a link through to our fundraising pages, because we think most parishes that find their way to this page and are looking at this guidance will also be thinking about how we're going to fund our project. So we've just put that there to be helpful. So here in one place are those key pieces of net zero carbon guidance for which you need to have due regard if you're making an application which is in one of these areas. Right, flicking back to the slides then, I mentioned the practical path for net zero carbon. So I'm hoping that most of the people on this webinar have already heard about it. Practical path for net zero carbon is literally 2 sides of A4. And it's where we suggest that any parish starts their journey. It's a quick summary, a quick starting point. And what it does is it says, right, where do I start in this first section? And that has got suggestions for things you could start with for your building, your heating and lighting, your people and policies, and then offsetting any residue. It then goes on to slightly bigger projects, which you're more likely to do if you're a slightly higher energy using church. And then on the second page, there's those, how do we really get to net zero? And that's got the big interventions that you probably only do if you're a very high energy using church. It's then got a what if section, which are things like, for example, if you're replacing a roof, to think about loft insulation, and a few things we guide people away from. If I click through on here, hopefully this will take us to the practical path. Does that work, David? Mm-hmm. Very good. So when you come onto this webpage, you get the practical path to net zero, and what we've created, as well as the 2-side summary, there's a self-guided checklist version. You can go here and you can find the self-guided checklist, and it takes you through, it has each of the dot points that's on the practical path to net zero, and you can mark it up and say, right, we've already done this one's not applicable, this one's not a priority for us right now, or now this one, I need more information, this one's a priority. And you just work through it. Maybe a subgroup of your PCC works through it together. And then at the end, you've got a place to summarize the priority actions and when you're going to review them as a PCC. So really, if you're thinking, where do I start? This is where to start. And increasingly, we're hearing from DACs that they are, for relevant projects, they're starting to ask for a completed copy of the practical path guided checklist, along with faculty applications. And it's also formed part of the best practice note for quinquennial architects and surveyors, the suggestion that when they write the QI report for a church, it should cross-reference the practical path. So we're trying to make sure that it all joins up. So before I get into the more specific changes, just a reminder for those of you that don't regularly interact with the faculty system about the fact that there are the 3 levels. So list A matters are things that a parish can do without seeking permission, as long as you're not breaching any of the conditions. List B matters are where you need to seek confirmation from your archdeacon that a faculty is not required. And if you get that confirmation from your archdeacon, then you can move ahead. And then full faculty is when you know you need to seek advice from the DAC and then permission from the Chancellor. So keeping in mind those 3 levels, the list A, the list B, and the full faculty, I'll then take us into the specific changes that have been made. So first up is some new additions to allow quick wins, some of the kind of things that David was talking about earlier. So additions to list A, things you can just get on with, as long as you don't breach any of the conditions, are draft proofing of doors and windows and pipework insulation. And added to list B, low energy light fittings and pew heaters. So with the draft proofing, The condition there is that the works do not affect the overall appearance or operation of the door or window and do not involve the replacement of a component. And for the pipework installation, we very simply added that into a matter that was already there that spoke about control equipment and various other specifics. We've now added another specific that says, and the insulation of pipes in the boiler room and ancillary service areas. So not pipework that's running through the main body of the church where it's visible, pipework in those places like boiler rooms and ducting. The low energy, so in terms of low energy light fittings, the light bulbs, just swapping one bulb for another for a low energy bulb, that's always been de minimis. You won't see it in the faculty rules because it's so small, it's not even mentioned, it's de minimis. But there's always been a bit of a barrier that sometimes the light fittings need to be changed as well. So it's now been made clear as a list B matter that you can install low energy light fittings as long as you follow the sensible conditions that are set out in the faculty rules. Pew heaters I'll come back to later when I talk about heating. Do you know what? I forgot to mention the photograph. I love using these thermal imaging camera photographs. If you haven't seen them before, the red is warm, the blue is cold. This is a photograph of the bottom of a church door. You can see the cold air coming rushing under that door. And I think these photographs really tell the story about the kind of things that we're trying to make simpler. We're trying to make it simpler that churches can deal with problematic drafts. This next thermal imaging camera photograph is, I think, probably my absolute favourite. It's showing a pew after 5 people who've been sat down have stood up and walked away. And it's an experience that we've all had. We've arrived at church, we have our body heat, we're feeling comfortable, we sit down, and during the course of the service, the warmth is moving out of our body into the pew and through our feet into the floor in front of us. And this photograph really explains this change to the faculty rules. It's quite a modest one, although it hit the press, it got picked up by the Times and the Telegraph, this one-word change. There has always been a matter there that said, A5, kneelers, hassocks, pew runners or cushions are permitted so long as they do not result in, and it used to just say, a change to the overall appearance of the church. And now it says a major change to the overall appearance of the church. There's also been added into A5 about carpet replacement, a specific phrase that says the introduction or replacement of movable floor coverings between individual pews. So that's specifically meaning runners, movable runners, strips of carpet that will go between pews, not in the aisles and not permanently attached to the floor. The next thing, again, is a modest but significant shift, and this is about cable trenches. We have made it easier, so it's now on list B, for the digging of a cable trench and the installation of cables and the attachment of wiring in the trench. This is to recognise, firstly, the fact that getting a good electricity connection is often absolutely key to a church being able to change its heating system over from oil and gas to electric. Secondly, that if a church wants to install EV car charging, that also requires good electricity connections. And thirdly, that more and more of our churches, because of COVID originally, have been moving to online activity. And so we want to be able to bring in broadband cables. So for all of those reasons, cable trenches have been made simpler. The conditions around this require that when the parish puts in its application to the archdeacon, with that they need to attach the proposed route of the cable trench. And then there are also conditions about the depth of the trenches, whether they're under land used for the passage of vehicles, at which point the trench has to be 600 millimeters, or whether it's under a footpath, in which case 450 millimeters. A condition that no cables exceed 1,000 volt rating, and a condition that if articulated human remains are discovered in the carrying out of the work ceases, it's reported, and the work does not resume until the court so ordered. So with those sensible conditions, cable trenches are now being able to move forward under list B. The next is about loft insulation. So there is a new requirement in those parts of the faculty rules under A1, A6 and B1, which were there to cover roof replacements. There is now a new condition that says the installation of roof insulation is considered. It doesn't say it has to be done, because sometimes it's not the right thing to do. It says it has to be considered. And there is now a new List B matter, which allows for loft insulation under List B for non-listed buildings. When a building is not listed, we don't have the same requirement to provide an equivalent protection, as it's called, to secular listed building controls. So we can be more permissive for the non-listed buildings, and this is an example of that. This next slide looks a little bit complicated. What it's aiming to do is to incorporate electric car charging into the various different areas in the rules where it needs to be mentioned in order to bring our rules entirely in line with the secular planning system about electric car charging posts. And that means it has to be mentioned in 4 different places in the rules. So under A7 as a List A matter is now a post-mounted EV car charger in the curtilage of an unlisted building. And then in 3 different spaces on List B, there are post-mounted in the curtilage of a listed building, wall-mounted on an unlisted church building, and wall-mounted on an unlisted church hall or other building. If it's not covered by one of those, it requires faculty in the same way that in the secular system it would require planning permission. There are also a set of conditions about the size of the charging post, about not disturbing the ground or disturbing the ground to the minimum possible, and the fact that the wall or the place where the post is going has to be adjacent to an area which may be lawfully used for off-street parking and not within 2 meters of a highway. I've mentioned a couple of places. The Rule Committee specifically looked at where it could be more permissive for unlisted buildings to make work easier in those cases. The majority of our buildings are listed, but there are a significant proportion which are unlisted. And so the Rules Committee looked specifically at what could be done in those cases to be more permissive. So as I've already mentioned, EV car charging has been made more permissive for unlisted buildings to bring it in line with the permitted development rules. Installation of roof insulation on an unlisted building. And then also solar panels have been moved to List B for a church that is unlisted and not in a conservation area. So that is bringing our rules about solar panels in line with the secular planning system, that these are the conditions under which a church could apply for permitted development under the secular system, and they can also apply to their archdeacon, that they should be able to move ahead with solar panels under List B if they are unlisted and not in a conservation area. That brings us on then to heating. So you saw from the slides that David presented at the beginning why heating has been such a major area for focus of this work, because we know that heating makes up the vast majority of the energy use of our churches, and that currently by burning oil and gas, we know that even in a small way, we're contributing to climate change. So we had to really think very carefully about what we could do with the rules about heating. You may well know that at the moment, under the previous rules, like-for-like oil and gas boiler replacements were under List A, whereas moving to a new heating system of any kind would be under full faculty. And that meant there was a real disparity of it being very, very simple to do like-for-like oil and gas, much more difficult to do anything that would be a low carbon solution. And we have attempted to make that much more equal. So let me start first with the thermal imaging picture, because I think it shows us what we know, what we've heard so many times about the fact that hot air rises. At the moment, our basic approach to heating, our start point for our heating is we think about how do we heat the church? How do we heat the whole space? And we do that by burning oil and gas in general, then using that to heat up water, which then circulates and heats up air. That hot air has to rise all the way to the top of our ceilings and come all the way back down until anyone is benefiting. And that is an inefficient way of making people comfortable in our buildings. What we're asking people to do is to think as hard about installing a new oil or gas boiler as they need to do about installing a different approach to heating, one which looks at how do we make people comfortable? How do we make people comfortable in our buildings whilst looking after our fabric, and using that as the start point for our work? So we have made it simpler on list B for pew heating to be installed. This is where we're installing, it's the installation of an electrical heating system for attachment to pews made in or after 1850. So there's a condition about the age of the pews and which are not of historic interest. The list B goes on to say that the details of the appliances, their proposed location and fixing, and the location of any cable runs are submitted to the Archdeacon when the Archdeacon is consulted on the proposal. Any work has to be done by a person whose work is subject to an accredited certification scheme, and no article of historic or artistic interest is removed or disposed of. So with those conditions, if you are a church that has pews, you can go ahead under list B with pew heating, and that's particularly useful in two sets of circumstances, one of which is our often smaller, often rural parish churches, which maybe are only being used one Sunday a month, maybe one Sunday a fortnight. And a simple pew heating solution will enable their parish to be warm for those Sunday services. The other area where it can be very useful is to have a hybrid approach, so that a church that does have space heating can reduce the hours it uses its space heating, and for smaller events and meetings and activities can use the electric pew heaters instead, thus reducing the amount that they're using their fossil fuel-based system. So that's the pew heating under list B. Then there's the question of boilers. In the currently unlikely circumstances that you're replacing a non-fossil fuel boiler with another non-fossil fuel boiler, that remains under list A. If you're replacing a fossil fuel boiler with a non-fossil fuel boiler in the same or similar location, that will now be list B. But like for like replacement, oil tanks, oil boilers, and gas boilers now require full faculty, and gas tanks are on list B. We know that this is controversial. It was much discussed in the working group. It was much discussed in the Rule Committee. It was much discussed at Synod when it went to Synod. And in each of those cases, upon reflection, it was passed, it was voted through at Synod as a recognition of just how important this issue is. Because if we replace an oil boiler with another oil boiler or a gas boiler with a gas boiler now that's got an operational life of 20, 25, 30 years, that parish is locking itself into fossil fuels way past the 2030 target. These rules do not ban oil and gas boilers. There's nothing here saying that they're banned. They're saying that for an oil or gas boiler to be installed requires the same degree of thought and planning and option appraisal as does installing a new low carbon solution. This slide just summarizes everything I've shown you before. So everything on the list is something I've told you about, which has now been made easier with appropriate conditions. And then on the right, the things which have been moved into full faculty, just two things, but very important things, like for like replacements of fossil fuel boilers and replacement of oil tanks. And I hope that when you look at this, you'll see from the balance of the left and the right-hand side of this slide, that real effort has been put into thinking about what could be made and should be made more permissive, as opposed to what small number of important things need to be made more difficult. The final one of my slides before I hand back to David to take us through the last thoughts and then move on to Q&A is just to say that this isn't just a theory. So every one of these green dots is a church that is already net zero carbon. It's about 7% of the churches that have completed the energy footprint tool. Their results show us that they are already a net zero carbon church. And in the vast majority of those cases, it's because they have some form of electric heating and they are getting their electricity from 100% renewable sources, either solar panels on their roof or from a valid green tariff. So this isn't a theory, it's something that's happening all around the country right now.
Thank you, Catherine. There's a couple of slides to go before we finish presenting, and then we'll turn our attention to the questions. If you've got questions you'd like to type into the Q&A, please be getting on with that and thinking about them so that we've got something we can meet your needs in how we respond to the things that are bothering you today and address them. So here's a couple of images from the landing page of the Net Zero Carbon page on the Church of England website. And this is a nice visual diagram that has been devised, and where you run your mouse across it, it will give you hints and tips and take you to bits of text and then to more detailed web pages about things you can engage with to do for different parts of a building. It deals with maintenance, sourcing energy, how you manage your waste, how you heat the place, how you make energy on site, and then what you do with the balance. So if you run your mouse over the sort of illustrative building, it will tell you about things you can put on the roof. We'll look at lights and all the rest of it. So if you find that a helpful way to engage, that will give you a way of going around your building and looking for opportunities, looking for things you can do to keep that building or to help move that building on a path to net zero carbon. I'm also going to make a tiny detour here and remind you all that one of the first things on the practical path to net zero is good building maintenance. If a building is dry, because there isn't a lot of water coming in, it is going to be a whole lot easier to get it warm because you haven't got to heat up the water as well as the air in the building. So if you can keep your building dry and in good order, it will help you a tremendous amount with your move onto net zero carbon. It will also help you on other things which you might want to achieve, like making the building look cared for and looked loved for. And that is shown and known to help keep your building safe from antisocial behaviour and help to contribute to keeping your building safe from heritage crime, and also just makes you a way more positive statement in the community. So all that you can do with keeping your building in good order to help you with net zero carbon is going to help you on many other fronts in the care of your building and the engagement of your church with its community. We all know that maintenance and that sort of thing isn't that exciting, but it does have paybacks across so many good things that you will want to achieve as a PCC or as a diocese to encourage your churches with. So a final slide of content, some encouragements to things that you can do to take forward a shift to net zero carbon in your church with your PCC, or for encouraging others in your diocese if you're in a position to do that. So get your PCC starts off with actually recognizing that the net zero carbon is something it wants to engage with. It's a choice each parish needs to work through itself. We obviously hope they all will choose to do so. It's for the parish to do that. And then use some of the free tools we have available to help you with your engagement. So the energy footprint tool is available to sign up for. It will help you understand how you're using energy, how much energy you're using, and where that is going. Catherine's already demonstrated how you can engage with a sort of tick box on the practical path to identify some easy wins, to identify some things to think about, and to help it to stand out where there are the bigger challenges. We've talked about maintenance already. We've talked about energy tariffs. And that third from a bottom point, avoid big projects for small savings. That's quite an interesting one. I want to really think about, particularly if you're one of those 25% of churches making 1% of the carbon footprint of the church. A big project for something that isn't going to be used much is probably not really going to pay back very much by way of carbon savings. So there is that sort of reality check. You get excited, you want to do the right thing. It's fantastic, we all want to do the right thing, but just understanding the context in which you are doing it, because one person's right thing may not be somebody else's right thing, just depending on what else is going, how much energy you're using, the quality and the age of the materials you're already using to heat or light your church. And you have some good experience, talk to someone about it, share what you've been learning to help other people do good things, or if you found something that actually didn't quite deliver as advertised, perhaps try to understand why and share it in a way that will help other people to do something better, rather than a sort of general grumpy way, we tried this and it didn't work. Well, we can all think of times we've done that, but it doesn't prove that what you're trying, you shouldn't be trying. You just need to find the right way of doing it or the better way of doing it. So we presented you a big challenge. We know it's a challenge, but hopefully some ways to engage, some easy starting ways to engage, as well as some tools to help you think about things, to move them forward, to get your churches, either your one way or the PCC, or churches in your diocese where an advisor or a DAC officer or member moved in the right direction. So thank you for the questions that have been coming forward. Catherine, you've had more time to read them in the last few minutes. What order should we take them in? When you've unmuted.
When I've unmuted. You'd think after 2 years we'd know. Some of the questions are about the faculty rules and some of them are broader questions. And I'm thinking, let's start with the ones which are specifically about the faculty rules and then see how much time we've got left. So everyone, if you are listening, if you've got questions after that, do find the Q&A. You can vote up other people's questions and you can add your own. And there's also, I think there's an important point in the chat as well that hasn't been phrased as a question, but it's worth us touching on. But let's take some of the specifics which are to do with the faculty rules. So let us start with Gary's question that says cable trenches, that would include Wi-Fi connections as well, presumably.
Basically, yes, if the Wi-Fi connection requires a cable to enable it, the cable can go in a trench in the churchyard under these same provisions. There are extra provisions in the rules we haven't talked about today. So if you're in a part of the country where cable access to Wi-Fi is really not going to do it for you, there is an additional provision put in as an amendment by a rural archdeacon. So if you are having Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi, so effectively a Wi-Fi booster on your church to receive a Wi-Fi signal and spread it and share it in the neighbourhood, that is now on the list. And if the question is actually about the sort of bits of kit you need in the church for modem and all the rest of it to actually get the signal from a cable live in the building, that's likely either to be de minimis, and some elements of that are picked up already in either list A or list B. So you should now be able to, on list B or with no permissions at all, get a cable to your church and get yourself set up on broadband or Wi-Fi.
Right, another question about the faculty rules. Does the new under pew heating in B4 cover the removal of redundant items such as boilers, radiators and pipes? Where is that covered, David?
It isn't particularly. It's an interesting question, actually, because I can see exactly why you're asking it. And at one level, it makes perfect sense, particularly if the heating kit is a menace, is in the way, is somehow hindering the life of a parish. I'm going to share a tiny sort of thought on this, and then if Catherine wants to come in and clarify it. If the kit for your hot water heating, which is probably what it is, isn't actually in the way and isn't doing any harm, part of me thinks maybe hang on to it in case in 10, 20 years' time, different technologies make it useful again. Clearly at the moment it isn't, but maybe technology will change, the life of a parish might change, and it might be useful in the future. It just isn't particularly useful now. It's got embedded energy it was made to create it and install it. And if there isn't a real urgency to remove something, it isn't doing any harm, part of me thinks perhaps keep things that might become good. Clearly don't keep rubbish, but a system that might work if this heat source was different and technology will make that heat source different in 5, 10 years, maybe it's worth not being too enthusiastic about removing stuff that isn't actually causing a problem, that isn't unsightly and a nuisance. Don't you? Got any thoughts on that, Catherine?
No.
But to actually ask your question, if you're putting in your B4 thing to put in under pew heating, stuff in with the lists of things you want to do, which goes to the Archdeacon, add to that list removal of redundant items, and if the Archdeacon's happy to approve it, he or she's happy to approve it, and if they think on this occasion they don't want to, they won't. But ask. If you don't ask, you certainly won't get.
Another question about pew heating. How does the extra electrical work get covered? The new distribution board, wiring to pews, how does that fit into the faculty system?
We talked about this at some length. I think it was a Green Working Party where there was an electrically competent person. And our intention was to make sufficient changes elsewhere in the faculty rules, various bits and pieces we haven't actually talked about today because they're rather ancillary. But the intention was to make sufficient changes elsewhere to enable this sort of thing to happen. So the cable trenches to beef up the electricity supply, for example, is an example of that. I know we spoke about things like distribution boards. I think there's a condition about the architect approving wiring routes, for example, to help cope with the new wiring. So we did what we felt we could to be reasonable, to make adjustments elsewhere to enable this provision to be meaningful rather than to be sort of tripped up at the first opportunity.
Yes, looking at the detail, I think there's an A6 on list A1 subsection 6 is works of maintenance, repair and adaptation not amounting to substantial addition or replacement, but including rewiring to existing, and one of those is electrical installations, and then there's more detail. So I think you would find that those changes, as long as they weren't breaching one of the main conditions about changing the appearance of a listed building, would be covered under those list A provisions. Does that sound right, David?
I think it does.
Question from Juliet. Am I right in thinking if we replace our gas boiler that provides heating, radiators and hot water for our church rooms that are in a listed church with individual electric radiators and an electric hot water heater is now list B?
I think you probably are, actually, and the overall feeling of the rules for sort of ancillary spaces, vestries and church rooms and so on does give generally slightly less attention to them than it does for the actual place where the worship is conducted. If in doubt, ask your archdeacon, but I think if the physical impact on the place is low, I would be extremely surprised if they were awkward about that at all.
I suppose it would depend, wouldn't it, whether the electric radiators were different enough in appearance and size and location from the previous hot water radiators as to whether the archdeacon felt that that counted as a significant change to the appearance of a listed building.
I think
that would be a matter of judgment, presumably, for the archdeacon.
Yes, and I think there should be ways to achieve this without making a significant change in the appearance.
So there's something from Pat, but it's not really a question. I'll come back to that one in a second because it's more of a comment about their kitchen. Right, I think so. The other one that seems to be about the faculty rules is a question about heat pumps from Margaret. So heat pumps are a significant change to the building, and so they would require full faculty.
That's correct. I remember very much the discussion about this. Clearly, for many buildings, it's one of the options, probably in some places really desirable. But one of the constraints of faculty rules operate under is we have to provide for a listed building equivalent protection to secular listed building consent. And a change which could amount to a change in character, therefore requires consent. And we felt that at the present place where we are with heat pumps, it was not appropriate to put them onto list B because we didn't think we could do it under the constraints provided to us under the way faculty operates. And also, there's reasonably likely with heat pumps either to be an archaeological intervention if you're making a trench or digging a borehole, which might be significant. And there are also elements with air source ones with sort of impacts on neighbours, letting people what you're doing, let people know what you are doing, installing ancillary equipment to go with them, possibly an impact on the setting of a building. So yes, they're not in there because they're not desirable, but some users, but they're not in there because we didn't feel we had the scope to do that within the faculty rules as we have to operate them.
And also, I think to an extent, David, the fact that a change to something like heat pumps is a significant change for the church, and that the good thing about the faculty system is that it brings the parish into contact with the advice and guidance of the diocese.
Absolutely.
And to make a change as significant as to move to a heat pump, especially when there are so many choices about the type of heat pump and how it's installed. Actually, the fact that the parish then has to engage with the guidance from the DEC can really only be beneficial. So I've had time to read properly. I think really Pat's thing here isn't really a question, it's a cautionary tale, which I think it is worth reading out. It's a cautionary tale of the fact that they agreed to move from I presume from a gas cooker to an electric induction cooker but that because the electricity supply was to its limit, they then had to not just pay for the cooker, but also pay for the electrical supply. And she is just saying we need to be aware of such issues. I think that's the end of the questions which are specifically about faculty. So let us touch on some of these wider ones. So there's one that says, I'm surprised clergy housing isn't mentioned in terms of where the church's energy use is to be found. Are there plans to address the clergy housing stock nationally or at diocesan level as well? So the faculty system doesn't apply to housing, which is why we haven't really been talking about it today. The faculty system applies to our parish churches. Housing is absolutely part of the call from General Synod, and that covers the housing which is managed by dioceses for their own clergy, and it also covers the retired clergy housing which is owned and managed by the pensions board. And so dioceses, to different degrees around the country, depending on how quickly they've been moving on this, are reviewing their own plans for their housing. Just this week, Oxford Diocese, for example, made a landmark announcement that it's going to be investing £10 million in upgrading clergy housing in their diocese. And whilst other dioceses might not be at that point yet, but plans are proceeding. Is there anything you wanted to say on that, David? The next question is from John that says, in terms of the actions on the graph, what's the relative payoff of them and which should we prioritize, or are you saying do as many as we can? That's so case by case, John. I couldn't answer for your parish because it depends what you've already done, what your start point is. That's why we suggest to people to go to the practical path to net zero, because that's got all of those different things on there in a pretty much a sense of prioritization by the different sections of where do we start, where do we go next, net zero. And then you can go through it knowing your parish and work out which ones of them are the priority for you. If you want to know more information about the Church Energy Audit Programme, you can look on our webinars page, and there's a webinar that's called A Vision of a Net Zero Carbon Church, and there's more information in there about the findings of our Church Energy Audit Programme that shows you that graph and also has a bit of a section on costs. The question from Glyn about when will green gas be available? As I understand, there is not sufficient available to meet demand. I think that's sort of outside of both of our remits, isn't it, David?
I think so. It is not an easy question to answer. You are correct about the supply and demand. It's possibly why we're not doing too much to encourage staying with gas anyway through what we're doing, that if you are with it.
I'm just going to have a quick look on the parish buying website because I'm pretty sure that as part of the green energy basket. Oh, I can't see quickly. I think as part of the green energy basket, there is now an option that if parishes ask that they can go onto a green gas tariff. I can't very quickly see. I'll try and look in a second and see if I can find the answer to that. Right, and the next thing is from Andrew. Under current planning legislation, it makes sense the EV charging points are installed to residential and business locations, but this will add an electrical loading demand to a church where no such provision currently exists, i.e. we don't have fuel pumps for cars. I do not see the need for EV chargers given that most congregations are well within typical EV range. As a DAC member, should we encourage EV charging provision? EV chargers will cost a minimum of £1,000 each to install. Do you want to go first on that, David, and then I'll chip in?
Yes, I will. First of all, we have a guidance note on EV charging on our website, which addresses actually some of the points you're making and some of the facts behind the questions you're raising about range and so on. So there's some guidance there that addresses the reasons a church might want to put in EV charging. And you would also have noticed on that slide of things you could do that the energy audit recommendations on EV charging were certainly not applied to every church and were applied to actually a fairly small section of 181 churches, which were done in that survey. So it is not for everyone. There's a couple of scenarios which I'll share with you where things might be relevant. I mean, actually, an example from where I worship, we're a urban church, There are streets around us where probably people might want EV cars, and provision for on-street parking is going to be low. The church has got some land which is public, which is given for parking, where we can make a provision which can earn us a little bit of money and make a useful provision for people living near us who perhaps want somewhere to charge their car. And there are commercial providers who will partner with you to bear the cost and pay you some rent or something, so that the PCC isn't taking a financial risk in using its land for something which will have a benefit but isn't perhaps a core missional activity of the church. Certainly one way of approaching it. It could also to do with the type of charger you can install, depending on the type of people who are coming to your church. So yes, for many people who are just coming to worship, you aren't going to charge your car at church because you won't, you've driven a couple of miles max. But in a church where people perhaps stop because you're a sort of place where people break their journeys to go to have lunch or something because of where you'll sit alongside a motorway system or something, there might be some local circumstances that make it particularly useful in some areas as just part of your wider contributing, using your land for a sort of wider and greater good. So that's a couple of thoughts on that answer. Catherine, you have some more thoughts, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's with EV charging, there's different reasons why you might want to offer it. You might want to offer it because you're a very urban parish with a lot of people in your community who don't have off-street parking. And by offering EV charging, you are then enabling your community to decarbonise their transport. You might offer it because you're a very rural parish and there is no other charging provision within striking distance. And therefore, by offering it, you enable people that are coming to the area to be able to charge, and therefore they can choose to make their journey by electric car rather than petrol car. You might want to offer it as a source of income for your church and charge people to be charging their car up. You might want to offer it in order that your clergy can move over to having an electric car. So there's a number of different motivations, and it depends a lot on your own circumstances. If the parish is in an area that already has significant provision of electric car charging in the area, it's probably not relevant. It really varies from circumstance to circumstance. So I think, so we've got a couple of minutes left. I just didn't want to stop without touching on the comment that Sophie put in the chat, because I think it's a really important one. She wrote, "My concern is that many of the 25% of churches contributing just 1% of the church of England's carbon emissions are likely to be rural, little used and on oil. I worry that the net zero carbon changes will hit these parishes hardest. And sadly, these are the churches most likely to close." So David showed you that slide at the beginning. The rural churches already have a tiny carbon footprint on average. On average, their carbon footprint is only 1.4 tonnes per year. And for context, my carbon footprint this year, even though we do nearly everything we can at home, is probably 10 or 12 tonnes. An average UK citizen, that would be. Those small rural churches, their carbon footprint is really low. And yes, they might have oil heating, but they're probably only using it a tiny amount of the week. So our main message to churches in that situation is just maintain your buildings. Just, if you can manage to stay on top of maintenance, if you can fix the broken windows, if you can make sure that your roof is wind and watertight, if you can clear out the gutters so that you don't end up with damp issues on the walls, brilliant. Focus on that basic maintenance. If you can, when the energy markets allow, switch to a green tariff. Those are the things, if you look at that practical path to net zero, those are the kind of no regret, simple actions that are in that first section. The kind of big interventions, the heat pumps, the solar panels, we wouldn't be expecting in general to see those in those small rural churches, because the embodied carbon in doing the project, the materials, the concrete, the piping, the cabling, the embodied carbon in doing the project wouldn't be paid back by the energy savings because the church isn't using very much energy already. So those big interventions are much more likely to be in the bigger, busier churches. So the only caveat there is what happens in those small rural churches when the current heating system is coming to the end of its life. And that is a question, because at that point is the only feasible option oil for oil, or can you move to one of the other solutions, pew heating, cushion heating, panel heating? You know, is there a solution which is feasible for your church that moves it away from oil and gas? But that's so case by case that it really needs local advice for your local circumstances at that point. David, is there anything you would want to add on to that answer?
No, it's a valid concern. It's not at the top of our list of things to do, and Catherine's given really practical way forward for certainly the time being of keeping that building in good order. So when you are using energy, you're using as little as necessary to achieve the outcomes you need.
We've gone past 5 o'clock, so I think we should bring it to an end. Thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you on running these webinars. Thank you to everyone who's joined today. I will send you around now the slides, the rules, and the marked up copy of this A and this B so that you can see the differences, and the links from the chat. Thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you at one of our future webinars.
Thank
Goodbye.
you all. Thank you. Bye.